Hello friends, welcome to this module. In this module, we will be looking at another kind of Java component which can be used within a servlet container. We will be looking at filters, a very interesting concept. Fine. Let us see what is this filter. Okay. The use of filters. Fine. What could be a filter used for? Filters, development wise, life cycle wise, looks something similar to a servlet, but it is not exactly a servlet. Servlets are resources. There are URLs for the servlet. Fine. As far as filters are concerned, no, filters don't correspond to a URL, though we do map them to a URL. What are filters? They are more something on the line of some kind of an interceptor, okay, some kind of an interceptor for a request on the server side. Let us see the whole mechanism of how a filter works on the server side. Okay. So, filter is again an interface in the javax.servlet package. We are back to the javax.servlet package. Okay. So, filter is simply an interface on the in the javax.servlet package. It can be used as an interceptor. It can be used maybe to intercept, to check some authentication. Some people might use it for authentication. It can also be used in advanced forms. It can even be used for transforming the responses which are going to a servlet to the client. Fine. Let us see how all the things work out here. Okay, a filter. Fine. So, if you look at a filter, the definition of a filter, the method within the filter, they are almost similar to the methods which we find in the servlet. Servlet had those 3 lifecycle methods. Similarly, filter interface also has its own lifecycle methods. Yes, like we have on the lines of servlet config, we even here also have a parallel interface called filter config. Okay, what were the methods in the okay? How do we configure? Yes, first if you look at the things which are required for using a filter. Fine. So, let us start with what goes in the deployment descriptor. So, if we come back to that web.xml file, yes, in web.xml file, if we had any servlet, we made a servlet entry and we also had a corresponding servlet mapping. Similar to the servlet and the servlet mapping entry, whenever we want to use a filter component, fine, we would be having the entry in the web.xml for a filter and a filter mapping, similar to the mappings, similar to the entries which are made for servlet and servlet mapping. A filter entry would have just like we had for the servlet, we had nothing but servlet name. Here we would have a filter name. We would have a filter class, no option of a JSP. So, filter can have an entry called filter name, filter class, which is nothing but the implementation of filter interface, and then you can have filter specific parameters which you would like the filter to use. Okay. So, if you have any specific parameters for the filter to use, we have that init param entry, just like we had the init param entry for the servlet. We have init param entry containing the param name and param value entries within a filter entry. Any number of init param entries may be specified for a particular filter. Fine. So, yes, we can have filter, any number of filter entries may be specified. So, these are different filter objects which would be created, but then each of those filter objects, they come into picture. No, they are not resources like we, when we were putting a servlet mapping, when we were putting the servlet mapping entry, what we were defining the URLs which become valid for this application. No, servlet, the filter mapping is not defining new valid URLs. What you need to give here are URLs which are already existing. It is not creating a new URL. The filter mapping is not for creating a new URL. It is nothing but it is kind of an interceptor for these kind of URLs. So, for example, I want to have a filter which is for star.hello. If someone uses a hello, if someone is trying to use any kind of a hello, I would like the request to be going through this filter. I want the filter to be applied before the request can even be started to be processed by a servlet. Okay. So, these are basically interceptors to a request, these are not the endpoints to a request, fine, endpoints to a resource, these are not resource endpoints, fine, these are interceptors to the resources, fine. If someone is trying to access a particular resource, you could set it up in the filter mapping that this specific filter should be applied, should be used before you enter into using this particular resource. So, that is where we have the filter mapping giving a filter name and the URL pattern. The URL pattern is not defining a new URL, rather specifying the URLs for which this filter becomes applicable. Okay. Let us see what exactly happens. Another thing which is different about filters as compared to the servlet. As far as servlet was concerned, yes, servlets may or may not have been loaded on startup, their initialization may not even take place, right, because they do not have a load on startup and they were never being used by, no client ever accessed that resource, or those objects were never created. But as far as filters are concerned, no, filters are always going to be created right at the start of the application. So, when the web container starts a particular application, during the startup of an application, the filter objects would be created. There is something more which is done with the filter objects, fine. There are a few other interfaces which are defined here. There is another important interface which is defined. There is an interface called filter chain. Oh yes, what is this filter chain? Filter chain is nothing but it is a sequence of filters. You know, when a particular URL hits the server, fine. When it hits a server, this URL is identified, fine. There might be multiple filter entries which qualify for this URL, fine, and this URL also there might be some resource which qualifies, ultimately it has to be, fine. If there is no resource which qualifies, no filter is applicable here, no filter would ever be used. See, whatever is being targeted as a resource must be a valid resource. Filters are not resources. You may have a servlet, you might have an HTML, you might have static content which could be the target of a resource. The URL targets a particular resource like this. But when it comes to a filter, no, filter is not the target, the targets are the other resources, fine. So, if a URL has come to the hit a server, the server would have identified which filters are applicable to it, provided that is a valid resource and not simply a filter, which filters become applicable to this. So, first it would then be creating object of the servlet request, the servlet response object should be created, fine, because that is something which has to be done by the container. It would come up with those objects of servlet request and servlet response. Next, it has already identified which all filters become applicable here. What is being done here is, when it has identified that these are all the filters which are applicable, it would create an object of filter chain. Filter chain is nothing but all those filters put together in that sequence, first filter, second filter, third filter, okay, all those filters, maybe if there are 3 filters for a particular request which are applicable, fine, it would put those 3 filters in a sequence at the end of the third filter in the filter chain. So, filter chain always has a set of filters, a sequence of filters, and after the last filter it keeps the target resource. Maybe if the target is a servlet, let us say for example, fine. So, maybe we have our hello servlet being targeted by a particular filter, fine, in which case yes, we will have a filter, let us say there are 3 of the, you might have configured n number of filters, maybe we have configured 5-6 different filters in our application, but for this URL maybe 3 of those are applicable, fine, 3 of those have qualified. So, a filter chain would be created with 3 filter objects. In this chain it would say first filter object is filter 1, second filter object is so and so filter, third filter object is another one, and the fourth thing which we have here is the hello servlet, which is actually the targeted resource, fine. Once it has identified this, it will then invoke. So, filter chain has been created. Now, what is this filter chain? How does it work? The filter chain interface only provides one method, and that method is a method called doFilter. This doFilter method has only 2 parameters, the servlet request and the servlet response. So, what is being done here? The way filter chains doFilter method works is like this. When this filter chain was created, it has 4 elements here. First 3 are the filters and then the targeted thing, fine. So, what it would do in this case is, it would pick up the first of them, fine, and invoke the life cycle method on that, the regular life cycle method. See, the filters like our servlet have the 3 life cycle methods. The first one being init method, where the parameter is filter config. The second one being, no, it is not the service method here. Here the name of the regular life cycle method of a filter is the do filter method. Init would be used during only the startup phase of the container, fine. When the web application starts up, the init method is going to be used, fine, and then the initialization of the filter config, whatever is there, fine. Filter config, in filter config, yes, we have those methods for getting the servlet context, getting the filter name, getting the context getting the init parameters for that specific filter, fine, similar to what we have already seen in the servlet config. So, filter config is almost similar to the servlet config, fine, and making available filter name, the init parameters and the servlet context. So, exactly like a servlet config. Okay. But yes, let us continue looking at what we have when the do filter, how that filter chain works, fine. So, how the filter chain would work. Initialization of those filters was already done, fine. So, what it has done is, yes, it has identified the first filter. Now, what is the regular life cycle method of a filter? The regular life cycle method of filter is also called do filter method. The method is do filter, but here it has 3 parameters. The parameters are the servlet request, servlet response, and a third parameter is nothing but a filter chain parameter, fine. The third parameter being the filter chain. The idea here is, yes, if we have this, when this do filter method is invoked, fine, on a particular filter, what the filter has, the filter is made available the request and the response objects, fine. It can look at the request, fine, it can look at the whole request and see what all things are, what is the information coming from the client, fine. It can look at the various aspects of the request, fine, what is being targeted, it can get the hold of the URL and every other thing, fine. The request object is available to the filter. Filter wants to do any kind of checking, it can do that. Maybe there is some blacklist, this filter may be just to prevent some blacklisted clients to reach the server. So, yes, as far as servlet request is concerned, servlet request even has methods to know who is the remote user, fine. It can know the remote IP address, fine. It has methods to get the remote host, fine. So, we have methods in the servlet request to know that, fine. So, this filter may use all such methods and like to take action in terms of whether maybe I would like to let the request proceed further, or I would like to prevent this request from proceeding further. If it wants to prevent the request from proceeding further, it is free to use the response object right here itself and give a response back, fine. So, it is give some negative response, it might use that send error method, fine. Yes, of course, the servlet response object is there, you could cast it as HTTP servlet response and use the methods there, fine. So, these both objects, the servlet request, servlet response here, because it is part of the javax.servlet package, they have used the servlet request and servlet response in their parameters, but these are basically HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response, since the protocol being followed is the HTTP protocol. So, these could then be so you could use them as HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response and use methods accordingly. So, one option could be, okay, I want to prevent it from going further, give a response here itself. Other option, fine. What has been done? Yes, when the do filter method was invoked, what are the we have request and response object, but there is a third parameter. What is that? It is the filter chain. The chain for whose part this filter is. This filter is part of a chain, fine. So, this chain has identified this as the first filter. So, this chain object is available to the filter also, fine, whose part it is, right. Now, the other option, if the filter decides that, okay, I would like it to proceed further, fine, I would like to let the request proceed further, then what the what the filter could do here is the code of the filter within the do filter method, the third parameter which is a filter chain object, on that it could simply invoke the method do filter again. See, what is this do filter on a filter chain doing? It's whenever it is invoked, it is simply identifying the next element. The next element, maybe if it is a final element, it is the resource, otherwise it is a filter, and on that it is invoking the regular life cycle method. For example, if the final, if it is a filter, it is going to call the do filter method with 3 parameters, where the third parameter would be the chain itself, fine, the request response object and the chain is itself, fine. Or if it is, maybe it is a, if it is at a final element and someone is calling do filter on it, where it has now the only element left out, the next one is the nothing but the servlet, yes, it would be calling the service method by giving the request and response objects, fine. So, the do filter is nothing but each time do filter on a filter chain would result in invocation of the regular life cycle method on the next element. It could be, if it is a filter element, which are the initial elements, it would be the do filter method, or if it is a final element, and if it is a servlet, it would be the service method, fine. So, that is the way a filter chains do filter works, fine. It would be just picking up the next and invoking the life cycle method there, fine. So, we have the fine do invocations of the do filters taking place, and then the final one is service, whatever is the targeted resource, fine, okay, fine. So, that is how the filter chain works, fine. Let us see what exactly what is the interesting thing in this filter, fine. The interesting part of the filter here is when you write a code, yes, if when we write a do filter method, what are we doing? We are initially getting the request and response objects, plus we are getting the filter chain objects. We are doing some processing initially. In this processing, yes, we are free to say, okay, we do not want to proceed further and give a response right there itself, or we are even free to modify the things which are available in the servlet request. You might modify the URL, you might add some attributes into it, maybe you are injecting some attributes which may be used further in some other components of the application, right. So, that kind of things, some pre-processing is what you may be doing on the request object, fine. Once finished with the pre-processing, and if it is valid, want to let it proceed further, you would be calling the chain.do filter. When you call the chain.do filter method, it goes to the next one, okay, it has gone to the next one, the next filter's processing is also done. Oh, I will call it as the next filter's pre-processing has been done. In the pre-processing, it might have done something, but then there is a do filter again there also, fine. Once we invoke do filter, suppose there is no more, there is no other filter left, then it is going to the target, fine. Whatever is the targeted URL, what is the targeted resource, that resource has generated some kind of a response. That response is available in the response given back to the do filter chain.do filter. Remember, it was the chain.do filter within the do filter method of a filter, fine. Filter has a do filter method. Within that, yes, we have a pre-processing and then we have a chain.do filter. Now, what happens is the second filter, we consider, let us say, only 2 filters in this case. It is the second filter whose chain.do filter finishes once the life cycle, once the response has been generated from the resource. The resource's job is over, the life cycle of the resource is over, the control is back to the filter number 2. And it is going to now proceed further with whatever is left out after the invocation of chain.do filter. So, you can see here that our do filter method of a filter is divided into 2 parts. There is a pre-processing part, there is this invocation of chain.do filter which is letting it go further, and there is a post processing part. Post processing in the sense that once the processing is done by the resource, fine, then the next steps which have to be carried out are the ones which you write after the chain.do filter. Okay. It is here the transformation, that if we want some transformation of the responses to be done, That is something which can be managed in this post processing, or in in this pre-processing, post processing, maybe there might be some other kind of information, some kind of logging information may also, it may be used even for the purpose of getting some kind of things logged out. Okay, this response was generated, some information related to what is the response generated, fine. But yes, there is one advanced option whereby one can actually transform the response which is generated by a resource in order to be able to do transformation of the response which is generated by a resource. There are more efforts needed here. What would be needed here is, no, we do not simply use, if we look at the whole thing, what happens whenever the service method of a servlet finishes. As soon as the service method of servlet finishes, yes, the chain, it would be entering that post processing part. But if we observe in the post processing part, as soon as the service method has finished, basically what we find is the response has actually been committed. That means you would not be allowed to modify it. So you can't be transforming to a great extent. Fine, the committing of the response has already been done. So nothing much could be done if someone is interested in transforming the response in this manner straight away. There are a few things which have to be changed here. What has to be changed? Oh, when I say chain.do filter, is it necessary that I should be using the same response object which is given to the filter? Is the filter bound to use the same response object, HTTP, find the servlet response object which was made available to it? It is not necessary that way. What it can do is, it can create its own request and response object. It is free to change the request and response objects and give it to the next guy, fine. So what could be done if someone is interested in changing the kind of response which is given to if someone is interested in transforming the response, that is, you are interested in taking control of what goes out as the response, a filter can do that. Fine, it can take control of what is the response that goes out. What it can do for that is, yes, instead of using the request object and the response objects, okay, here we are concerned with the response part. Instead of using the response object which comes from the in the do filter method, fine, a filter in its implementation can create its own object of response. Okay, here creating your own object of response, or you will have to write your own class. Of course, you will have to write your own class, but writing a class to implement the servlet response interface, oh my god, there are so many methods which have to be implemented. No, do not worry about all those methods. We have a class which is available to us. This class is, there are these two classes which are available, one in the base, in the generic part, which is in the javax.servlet. We have got a class called, we have these classes here. We have in the javax.servlet package, we have a class called HTTP response wrapper. We have these classes called HTTP response request wrapper, HTTP response wrapper, which are in the part of javax.servlet package, and we also have these classes called which are in javax.servlet.http package. We have got the HTTP servlet request wrapper and HTTP servlet response wrapper. These are classes. These classes have constructors which take as parameter the request and the response object. The idea here is, yes, it acts as a wrapper for an existing HTTP request object. So, for example, I am interested in transforming the I am only interested in transforming the response which comes from a client. So, I do not want the client to be putting a response in the regular HTTP in the response object. So, what I might do here is, I might create my own subclass of the HTTP or the servlet response wrapper and just override the get writer method. I do know here that the servlet is going to be generating a response using the get writer method. If he is going to write the content using the get writer method, fine, I would like to change that for him, so that he can, once he uses the get writer method, he does not write into the request into the response which is available from the container, but rather I have created my own object where I can force him to write that into some buffer of my own. Maybe I will use a buffer writer fine. We have the string writer object. So, a string buffer would be used internally. So, I can use a get writer to return an object of print writer which wraps a string writer object. Fine. So, anything which is written by the servlet actually does not go directly into the response of the container, buffer of the container, but rather it goes into the string writer object which we created. Fine. So, we could have our own class of servlet, a subclass of the servlet response wrapper which is overriding the get writer method, so that the get writer does not write to the buffer of the response, but writes to our separate string writer object. Fine. So, such things can be used. So, when such thing is used, yes, in the post processing part, that buffer could then be examined and then be used to write into the actual object which was available from the container. Fine. So, that way, yes, even post processing is possible for the purpose of making transformations in the responses which are generated by the from the servlet or any other resources whichever is there. Fine. So, filter, fine, how it works? Yes, you may have a number of filters which are available. Fine. The way sequence of the execution proceeds in the filter is the URL targets a particular resource. Fine. So, if the URL targets a particular resource, the filters which have been identified for that resource would be put in a sequence using a filter chain object. The lifecycle methods, that is the do filter methods, are getting invoked on each of those objects. So, if it has identified filter 1, filter 2, filter 3, the do filter on filter 1 is invoked, the pre-processing finishes on filter 1, chain.do filter results in invocation of the pre-processing of filter 2. It finishes the pre-processing of filter 2, chain.do filter of filter 2 results in proceeding to the invocation of pre-processing of filter 3. It finishes with the pre-processing of filter 3, chain.do filter results in invocation of service on a servlet, for example. Fine. Once a service on the servlet finishes, it proceeds with the post processing of filter 3, finishes with the post processing of filter 3, which would in turn result in finishing going back to the post processing of filter 2. By having finished the post processing of filter 2, then it would come back to filter 1 and do the post processing of filter 1. Fine. So, this is something which is interesting. Fine. We have the filters being used for pre-processing, the do filter method of a filter interface getting divided into two parts, pre-processing and post-processing. The pre-processing and the sequence in which this is done is, yes, pre-processing of 1 followed by pre-processing of 2 followed by pre-processing of 3, fine, finishing the life cycle of the getting the response from the resource, finishing the post processing of filter 3, then filter 2 post processing, and then filter 1 post processing, and then that is the end of the filter processing. Fine. So, the end of a request is happening like this. A request processing goes through a number of filters, fine, which we have set up in the filters, which we might have set up in the web.xml file. So, we can write our implementations of filter. As far as filter are concerned, we know there are only 3 methods: init method with filter config, do filter method with 3 parameters. Here remember, the third parameter is the servlet request, servlet response are the first 2, but the third parameter here is the filter chain. Filter chain is useful for passing it on to the next filter or the next resource, fine, whichever it may be, fine. And then we also here also we have the destroy method, the regular lifecycle method called destroy, fine. So, that is how a filter interface works, fine. Okay. So, that is for this. In the next module, we will be looking at another interesting another set of interesting components which we have in the servlet API, fine, which can be which are also to be specified in the web.xml if you want to use them. We have this thing called the listener interface. So, next module will be on the listener interfaces, fine. So, thank you.